From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, brought to you by the Center for American Institutions at Arizona State University. With me today is somebody I talk to a lot. My guest is Nathanael Mickelson. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia, and maybe most importantly, my co-author on on a few different projects. um, Particularly one that was just published in Business History Review a couple of days ago. I think this is an interesting subject. I think it's an interesting article, mostly because I participated in writing it. So I think it's interesting, at least, and I hope you guys do as well. And so I brought Nathaniel on in order to have him, hopefully, and myself less hopefully, be able to explain our article and why it matters. The title of the article is called "Equality of Agriculture: Robert L. Owen and the Populist Federal Reserve." It argues that the orthodox interpretation of the Federal Reserve's origins is slightly incorrect, and that there are reasons why that matters for Fed behavior moving forward. I've been talking for far too long here. Nathaniel, welcome to the show. Really glad you could join.
Thank you so much, Rob. I can say, as a longtime listener of the foremost South Dakota political podcast outside the state of South Dakota, it's an honor to be on. I'm sure your avid South Dakota listeners are probably disappointed someone with the last name Mickelson is not here to talk about South Dakota further. I will mention shout out to Bushnell, South Dakota Mickelson. So that's family connection there. But yeah,
Well, I'm sure the Mickelsons and Bushnell are all listening.
well, certainly.
Um, okay. So Nathaniel, before we really get into the article itself, I'd just like to ask about maybe a quick little methodology question, which is this is a type of history that engages with economics, but it is not really an economic history. Are you able to explain the difference?
Absolutely. So I there has been kind of a tension between broadly we call it qualitative and quantitative approaches to economic history. And really what we mean by this is qualitative approaches are sort of narrative, archival, they're about the story of economic circumstances, and economic theories may inform how we discuss and express and interpret the unfolding of economic consequences in past and events. But ultimately, it's largely archival, it's largely written prose. In contrast, the quantitative approach to economics, which is often what's kind of classic economic history today, um, is largely driven by a desire to understand the causal effects and causal relationships between different historical variables. And history kind of acts as a case study by which you can design a model of how the economy works, and you can test whether or not that model accurately describes what happened or what the relationship between different economic variables is to one another. So, economic historians will try to use a model of the past and then test these models against past data, and that'll inform their interpretation of the historical event. While qualitative approaches to economic history, what you and I are participating in, uses non mathematical data, we use archival data to explore and explain and contextualize other aspects of economic events that can't necessarily be completely captured by models.
Right, right. And okay, and in this case, what we're really talking about, which is again very difficult to explain through quantitative models,
Mhm.
is a major political contest for control of the Fed, or for control over the narrative of what the Fed is, perhaps, is a better way of saying it. So I'm gonna just read from the paper here. Um, and this is what we call in the paper the orthodox interpretation of how the Federal Reserve came to be. Um, I'm going to quote Alan Greenspan here, who described it as a compromise between the New York money center banks and the rest of the nation, still largely rural. According to this interpretation, after JP Morgan single handedly coordinated a bailout of the US economy amid the 1907 banking panic, policymakers realized that the country could not rely on the longevity and beneficence of its most powerful bankers. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island secured the passage of the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which established the National Monetary Commission to study the causes of the panic and advise on potential remedies. A secret meeting occurred at Jekyll Island in 1910, where the technical aspects of a central bank were formulated in what became known as the Aldrich Plan. When Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party won the 1912 elections, the Democrat Carter Glass of Virginia largely followed the Aldrich Plan in crafting the Federal Reserve, otherwise known as the Glass-Owen Act, with a few trivial concessions to alleviate the concerns of rural skeptics. Okay, why do we think that that doesn't quite capture the entire story?
That's a great question because it's one that's lasted for nearly a century now, and has remained popular for over a century. But where your and my article intervenes in this question is that largely this traditional account of the Federal Reserve is focused on the functionality of the Federal Reserve System, and it's interested in kind of explaining where this functionality comes from. And this can flatten some of the complexity and debates around the creation of the Federal Reserve. So, this neat interpretation that we have of the Aldrich Vreeland Plan into the Glass Owen Act, with Aldrich crafting it and then Glass implementing it, functionally, there's a lot of similarities because ultimately, right, to some degree, economics is a math problem. And at a certain point, you only have a few different ways you can handle certain questions. And a lot of the debate prior to the creation of the Aldrich Plan was shaped in a large amount of agreement. So we could talk later about some of these things like asset backed currency is largely accepted as a need. What the problems are is largely accepted as a need. And so it makes sense that you see the Aldrich Vreeland Plan, its support for what we'll call an asset backed currency, its support for solving the issue of currency elasticity. And then you see Carter Glass's plan that adopts these things, and it looks like a clear continuity. What this forgets is that actually a lot of the debate over the organization and structure of the Federal Reserve and how it's supposed to function is pretty intense and significant in expecting how the Federal Reserve is going to act. And the second aspect of this is that within this neat model of what the Federal Reserve is, there actually is a significant amount of interpretation and discretion that comes into the hands of the board that is interpreted as being defined as an easy problem, that this is just the way it's going to be. And that turns out not to be the case at all.
Okay. Okay. So when you're talking about, uh, sorry, functional, functional the history of the Federal Reserve, a functional understanding of the Federal Reserve's history, perhaps. I mean, I think a really good example of this might be that, a lot of histories of the Federal Reserve over the last 30 years, um, certainly since the '08 crash, have been focused on the Fed's role as the lender of last resort, right? And that and so, Nathaniel, are you able for a second maybe to explain what the lender of last resort is and why Fed historians are so consumed by this discussion?
Absolutely. So the Federal Reserve, as it's created, is largely intended to solve two problems. One of them is that there's a high frequency of banking panics throughout the post Civil War history. I mean, throughout U.S. history in general. But you have a massive banking panic in the 1870s, a massive banking panic in the 1890s, the panic of 1908 that's barely averted. And one of the main goals of the Federal Reserve is, can we solve that panic? Can we fix that panic? And a connected issue to fixing that panic is ensuring that money is able to get to the banks that it needs to get to stave off bank runs where people are going in and demanding cash out of the bank and forcing banks into insolvency. And so this lender of last resort is the central bank, in this case the Federal Reserve, capable of making that cash, injecting it into the economy, and propping up weak banks' assets to give them enough cash to survive these runs? It's an emergency lender to stave off this kind of fear of an impending crisis.
Right. And, and not just can it, but is there the willpower among Federal Reserve officials to actually do it?
Absolutely.
So one of the for those of you who know this history, this is going to be very repetitive for you, but why is the lender of last resort considered such an important question in economic history? What started this discussion?
Perhaps the classic roots of this discussion really comes down to a case in which everyone believes the Federal Reserve should have acted as a lender of last resort and failed to. And that is directly the case of the post 1929 stock market crash. The Federal Reserve was very skeptical of lending to many of the banks that were failing. The Federal Reserve viewed that many of these bank failures were due to unscrupulous practices, excessive speculation, and that they believed these bank failures were a likely necessary consequence to discipline the market. However, the result of the Federal Reserve not really engaging, not trying to stave this banking panic, is the entire collapse of the US financial system and then what follows as the Great Depression. And so, the extent to which the Fed is to blame for the Great Depression, it's not necessarily the cause as much as it's understood to be a key component that their reluctance to act as a lender of resort created the Great Depression as bad as it was. And that traces to arguments advanced by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in the 60s. And this has been an argument that since then has been debated to varying degrees of how much the Federal Reserve is to blame, how much there are external factors like international trade and finance. But that is where the focus has largely come from, is that the Friedman and Schwartz critique of the Fed has persisted in memory. And Ben Bernanke, the Fed chair during the Great Recession, specifically evoked Friedman and Schwartz's argument in explaining the central bank's response to then crises.
Right, which was to operate as the lender of last resort and to major failing hedge funds and international banks.
Yeah, aggressively and expansively make credit available.
Right. Now, of course, Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns were allowed to be were allowed to be restructured or dissolved. Were allowed to be dissolved, but particularly, AIG and other major banks were supported by the Federal Reserve, given emergency liquidity funding, so that there was no currency shock like occurred at the end of 1930. Okay. So yeah, so I mean, the reason I wanted to talk about that is that I do think that this discussion of the Fed as a lender of last resort has kind of dominated, I think, the literature on the Federal Reserve. And so, why does the origins of the Federal Reserve matter to scholars that are interested in the question of whether the Fed understood its role as the lender of last resort?
So, this is a fantastic question. I think it sets up really what we are trying to get at in the piece overall. Just as a little analogy, Rob, you're in Arizona, and I like to joke with you that in Phoenix, right, the river turns on and off for some reason. Uh, um, that there will be a dry bed during the day, and that at certain points it'll flood with water as water is kind of facilitating and moving out.
It's called
When you think,
irrigation.
yeah. We have rivers here. Uh, as in the case of the Federal Reserve, in its creation versus today, what I think matters is when we think of the lender of last resort today, that lender of last resort is when all of a sudden there becomes a credit drought, when all of a sudden there becomes a credit shock, when all of a sudden there becomes a credit scarcity, the Federal Reserve can overwhelm that by making cash available. So now it's viewed as largely an emergency measure. But in the creation of the Federal Reserve, in many ways, the forgotten author of the system that you and I talk about, Robert Owen, views the Federal Reserve as creating a financial irrigation. It's directing and allowing funds to flow to areas that are otherwise basically credit deserts.
Right. Okay. So I think that although we're not the first people to ever talk about Robert Owen's role in the creation of the Federal Reserve, I suspect we are pretty close to the first ones to give him as much credit as we do for the creation of the Federal Reserve. Who is the person who is usually credited with the creation of the Federal Reserve?
So if you're tying it strongly to the Aldrich plan, then it's usually Nelson Aldrich, but carrying it over the finish line, unquestionably the individual is Carter Glass.
Oh,
Um,
okay,
so
who's Carter Glass?
so Carter Glass is the chairman, I believe, of the House Banking Committee or House Finance Committee. And in this position, Carter Glass inherits after the 1912 midterms the role of kind of crafting and adapting the Aldrich-Vreeland plan
Well,
to the new
not the 1912 midterms, the 1912 general.
yeah, 1912 general.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah.
But after the 1912 elections, his job is to adapt the Vreeland plan to meet democratic needs and demands. And so Carter Glass has this kind of classic work, Adventures in Constructive Finance, that is his telling of the creation of the Federal Reserve System. It comes out about a decade after or over a decade after the Federal Reserve is created. And it is basically his kind of self proclamation and self claim to authoring the Federal Reserve System and creating it.
And he claims that what he basically did is he slightly tweaked the Aldrich plan.
Absolutely. For Carr Glass comes from a tradition inside Southern politics that can be called Bourbonism. Basically, Bourbonism, it's a particularly conservative strand of democratic thought that largely looked at Northeast industrialization and viewed that as the future of the South as well. And so it tried to develop the South industry wise, financial wise, credit wise. It accepted the gold standard orthodoxy. And largely, Bourbons were basically trying to make the South an equal industrial counterpart to the North. The primary concern for Bourbons was removing kind of their belief of an economic hegemony in the North. And so for Carter Glass, when he designed the Federal Reserve System, he took that Vreeland plan economics and the
Aldrich plan.
foundational economics underlying the Aldrich Vreeland plan, and he adapts that to a system of governments, 12 dispersed or 12 diffused regional banks with regional autonomy to kind of check and try to remove the influence of New York over the system.
Right.
And
So
that's his
why
primary
yeah,
contribution.
right. So why does that, at least according, to the Bourbon way of thinking, Carter Glass's way of thinking, why is that beneficial?
So, before the creation of the Federal Reserve System, one of the classic problems in banking is that the vast majority of the nation's capital and credit is tied up in the Northeast. And for banks outside the Northeast, you basically get at the end of a long link of intermediaries to get a loan. It could be a country store, it could be a local bank, and then that bank would contact another bank, and then that bank would then have eventually contact to New York. And so New York was largely viewed as the center of all credit prior. By creating a regional reserve system, the idea was you were pooling all the regional reserve members' resources into a large bank in that area that could then borrow in between each other. So instead of being reliant on the private banks of New York, say if you were in the deep south, you would be in Atlanta's district. Atlanta's Federal Reserve would go to New York's Federal Reserve and negotiate a loan from New York's Federal Reserve. And in theory, this was equals within the Federal Reserve System negotiating and trading and acting as clearinghouses for loans between one another.
Right. And then the idea was that um, that would equalize Southern elites with Northeastern elites, which
Absolutely.
was
They would have kind of key equal negotiating power in this.
right. And this comes after a period since the Civil War where the South is um, uh, economically struggling, for lack of a better word. Um, Before the Civil War in the antebellum South and the slave South, some of the richest people in the world lived in the South. And despite the massive amount of, despite slavery for white people, at least white people who frequently owned slaves, the economy was, the South was powerful, was economically very powerful and politically very.
Mhm.
But coming out of the Civil War, the South is marginalized both politically and economically. And so with Carter Glass is of a generation of Southerners who comes to kind of political consciousness in 18, in the era really after 1877. 1877 is this year called, is redemption, which is the end of Reconstruction in the final
Mhm.
holdout states. And there's a major political crisis in Virginia in the early 1880s about whether or not the state should actually pay, what's the word I'm looking for? Should pay the debt, should acknowledge the debt and actually pay the debt that the Reconstruction Virginia government had accumulated.
Mhm.
And Carter Glass believed that it was absolutely necessary to pay that debt, even though he didn't like the debt because he came out of the Redeemer tradition that was kept out of power during the Reconstruction period, because he knew that it was necessary to pay those debts in order to attract Northeastern capital. In order to pay those debts, the state government had to spend practically nothing. And Carter Glass was okay with that. There's an extreme form of austerity in this period.
And you should note that in the case of Carter Glass specifically, one of the things is all these men are born right before or during the Civil War.
Mm.
And so their consciousness is that their fathers were engaged in the Confederacy to some degree. In the case of Carter Glass is seemingly an up from the bootstraps type. He becomes kind of an independent reporter from Lynchburg, but he embeds himself and is promoted in the Virginia political machine, and cultivated by it. And of course, for Glass, white supremacy is no small part of that. But that is the kind of system, that autonomy of Virginia over itself, over its race relations, over its economic independence. That's the group that promote Carter Glass to power.
Right. And the opposition group, which wanted to, what's the word I'm looking for?
The adjusters?
The readjusters. Yeah, yeah. The ones who wanted to, what's the word I'm looking for? Not discredit the debt. What's the word I'm looking for? Not acknowledge the debt, not pay
Yeah.
down the debt. Wanted the state government repudiate. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah.
They wanted to repudiate the debt, and they said, like, it was set up by corrupt northern Reconstruction governments, and it was all of those bonds were designed to enrich Northeasterners, and we should therefore not actually pay those debts, and instead we should use government funds to actually do things like invest in public schools. Anyway, so that's kind of the political debate in the 18, and Carter Glass comes to power through this, and he's a very committed anti-readjuster and very committed bourbon. And as you said, that's might partly because bourbons are typically considered elites, which is where they got the name bourbon from. Um, and they But Carter Glass is from a working class background, at least a lower middle class background. And so gaining entree into these circles maybe meant that he was even more dogmatic about these issues than somebody who was an elite in bourbon circles. Okay, so that was a long discussion on Carter Glass. Hopefully people know who he is now. Um, and Carter Glass's name is on the Federal Reserve Act.
Mhm.
And so Carter Glass, these bourbons in many ways are allied, even though they want equality with Northeastern elites. In many ways, they have the same policy preferences.
Yes. They share the same orthodoxies.
What do you mean by that? Can you maybe talk a little more about that?
Absolutely. So in credit and banking circles, the orthodoxy is actually quite intellectually conservative, or at least in its practice, it's intellectually conservative. At the time, good banking theory, sound banking theory, was that money gets its value by being exchangeable with something valuable. In the case of banking theory in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that's gold. Currency gets its value from being a redemption note for gold, and bourbons largely agree with that. When Grover Cleveland becomes president of the United States, bourbons are largely his biggest supporters within the Democratic Party, and it's bourbon Southerners who are getting promoted. And this orthodoxy is that you have gold, it acts as a discipline on your lending then, because gold is finite, because you can only lend out so much money, you're going to be judicious and careful and only lend to those with good, high character.
In this, I think that some people assume that the South during this period, because they're all Democrats, basically are all agreed on virtually everything. This notion of the solid South. What do you think of the notion of the solid South?
Doesn't hold up well. There's a classic work by V.O. Key way back in the 1940s that's all about the diversity, or 1940s, 1950s, that's all about the diversity of political thought in the South post 1956. Even between states at a statewide level, their idea, even in single party states, there's differences in their views of what is good policy. Um, and the thing to remember is that all of these Southerners, especially all the Southerners who describe themselves as Democrats, subscribe to Jeffersonianism and Jacksonianism as rhetoric, but their definitions and understanding and meaning of these ideas are evolving tremendously. The Bourbons take a pretty straightforward. They like the limited government that Jefferson and Jackson espoused because they think a limited federal government strengthens state control. However, if you go further west, as states become wider, as their populations or as their economics become increasingly agricultural, as independent farmers make up a larger proportion of those states' voting populations, Jacksonian takes on a different meaning. Jacksonian becomes anti-special interest. Jacksonian and Jeffersonian becomes pro-farmer, pro-republic of virtue, and that the independent farmer is the key person in this. And in that moment, west of the Mississippi River, or where the Mississippi River kind of acts as an inflection point, your political philosophy of Jeffersonianism and Jacksonianism evolves into the state has to protect the virtuous republic, and protecting the virtuous republic means taking care of the independent farmer.
Yeah, that's excellent. Um, I don't think you've ever explained it that well. That was really good. I've heard you explain that lots of times, and I don't think you've ever explained it that well. That's awesome. Um,
Rococo, the inspiration, just
okay. So, we've talked a lot about Carter Glass, we've talked a lot about the Bourbons, and we're kind of approaching this other group, who believe, in the virtues of the small independent farmer. They're not big landlords or captains of industry like you might find in Virginia and North Carolina. They're small independent farmers. On the guy who they're typically most associated with in the 1890s is William Jennings Bryan. Are you able to explain a little bit about William Jennings Bryan and why many Southerners, especially Southwesterners, were attracted to Bryan's politics?
certainly. Although I will defer to you, I'm sure you'll catch me up on what aspects of Brian I forget. He plays a bigger, more role in your research than mine. Brian is this remarkable charismatic figure from Nebraska, from Omaha, Nebraska. Um, One of the great political struggles of the post-Civil War era is that the scarcity of credit, this reliance on independent white farmers for votes, is a feature of both the West, west of Illinois, and the South, and Southwest especially. And yet creating an alliance between those two is remarkably difficult because of the Civil War divide, and memories of the Civil War divide last. Brian serves as this figure that kind of crosses these thresholds, arguing for a sort of moral economy. He's evocative of Christian rhetoric throughout his speeches, and he links kind of Christianity and these evangelical orations with an economy much fairer and respectful to the farmer. He's skeptical of international interest and empire. And again, while he's speaking and critiquing like international empire, there is a prevailing view, especially of those in the Southwest, that the North is an empire domestically. Whether it's an empire through its control of credit, whether it's an empire through its control of railroads. And Brian kind of calculates this rhetoric of how do we return the government to the people in that kind of Jacksonian, Jeffersonian reform of the government is to protect the farmer, to protect the independent yeoman, to protect the virtuous citizen.
Yeah. He runs on an anti-plutocracy, you know,
Mhm,
platform, and which goes back to the 1880s,
mhm.
in various forms. Um, and that for Southerners who are attracted to the anti-plutocrat message, they aren't necessarily just thinking about New Yorkers. They're also thinking about their bourbon neighbors.
Absolutely. You mentioned redemption earlier. Part of redemption is that we see Jim Crow and redemption arise in response to established bourbon Democrats trying to check biracial populist challenges throughout the South and Southwest.
Yeah. I mean, that is way too complicated a story to tell today. It is that there's a lot of books on that if you're interested, but that is a very complicated story and probably not one we can afford to tell today.
No.
But anyway,
Yeah.
it's Southern history uh, at its most interesting. All
The
right.
point is the South must solve.
The cell is not solid. Yeah, fair enough. All right. So after William Jennings Bryan, there's sort of an the radical movement kind of fizzles out a little bit in the Democratic Party. The radical Bryanite movement kind of fizzles out. But there's this new figure from the Southwest who is not really a radical, but sees things through the lens of the independent farmer. Can we talk a little bit about Robert Owen's biography?
Absolutely. So Robert Owen is fascinating for so many different reasons. He is a one of a kind figure. It's very rare that you like, yeah, this person is completely like distinct, but when you look at Owen's background, so Owen is half Cherokee, I believe. He's half Cherokee. His mother's Cherokee. His mother is the daughter of a sub chief of the Cherokee Nation. His father is a railroad magnate and banker from Lynchburg, Virginia. So Carter Glass jokes in his book that he and Owen grow up a block from one another, a stone's throw between their houses. Owen's father dies, I believe, after the 1873 panic.
Yeah, and the company goes insolvent.
Yeah.
The railroad goes.
Yeah, the railroad goes insolvent, his father dies after the panic. Owen completes his studies at Washington and Lee University, and then his mother, Owen, and his sisters, migrate to Oklahoma to claim his mother's allotment in Indian Territory. So Oklahoma at this time is not a state. Owen moves out there. They occupy Indian Territory, which is mostly eastern Oklahoma, and they settle in the town of basically Muskogee. And in Muskogee, Owen becomes kind of this everyman. He opens a bank, he runs a law firm. His law firm was particularly successful in winning a major case over Indian lists, which is a sorting mechanism for US obligations within Indian nations and citizenship roles. Owen is this quintessential everyman. Well, as a part of the Bank of Muskogee, he gets a firsthand experience of the difficulties of country banking. He'd lived in the center in Lynchburg, and now he is in the periphery in the West. And Owen is this unique figure of having this intellectual academic training at Washington and Lee University, which is the same university Parker Glass or Carter Glass will lean on for economic advice when crafting the Federal Reserve. But Owen now has the experience of running and operating a bank where it's difficult to get credit, where you realize that no one is quote unquote a sound investment according to standard banking orthodoxy. And so Owen gets a firsthand confrontation of the realities of the frontier with the limitations of orthodox technocratic banking language.
Right. How are you supposed to start a farm? You need credit for the farm,
Yeah, you need
but every farm is a bad credit risk in Oklahoma.
Absolutely. You need a mortgage, and no banks want to give mortgages. You need to be able to get fertilizer and tools and fence wire. How can you get all this? It's difficult to get credit, it's difficult to get loans, and then moreover, you don't have any cash out there. Everyone moving west is moving west for opportunity. for the most part. And so you're not talking about really wealthy endowed capital to build a small bank from and lend and work from. You end up, in the case of Owen, relying on these correspondent banks all the way back to New York in order to get credit.
Right, and the closer you get to New York, the more reluctant to lend you'll find people.
Absolutely. And so the other thing that's interesting about Owen is that after the banking panic of 1893, after that crisis, Owen watches as nearly every bank around him goes under. He manages to keep his bank afloat. He watches as farmers lose their farms. And as he watches this collapse of Eastern Oklahoma's economy, Owen pays with his own money to go to Europe and study central banking in Germany, in France, in England, going to the central banks, meeting with the governors of those central banks, and starts recording and making lists and notes on how they approach central banking. And Owen begins thinking about his own journey of what would central banking reform need to look like. And at first, he tries to push these reforms through William Jennings Bryan and populist affiliated senators in other states. Again, Oklahoma is not a state, so he can't write to his representative. So he writes to neighboring Arkansas, where there's a similar economic conditions, and gets their senators start advocating for these measures.
Okay. When does Owen enter the Senate?
So when Oklahoma becomes a state, so after 1908, Owen enters the Senate.
And he is remarkably, despite only being in the Senate for 4 years, is the chair of the Senate Banking Committee.
Yes,
Okay.
he's considered unrivaled expert on finance.
Mhm.
And banking, and he's immediately selected pretty much when Democrats take power as the chair of the committee.
Okay. Um, so what's Robert Owen's role typically considered in the story of the origins of the Federal Reserve?
Owen is a fleeting figure in the classic narratives of the Federal Reserve System. And the reason why Owen is a fleeting figure is twofold. In Carter Glass's account, Owen is a nuisance, a kind of populist pest that reminds Carter Glass of his nightmares of Jacksonianism. But the other thing that's important to note is that Owen is viewed as a radical, as a saboteur in Glass's account. But more importantly, for traditional narratives, Owen is a close ally of William Jennings Bryan, and Owen also exerts influence through McAdoo on Wilson. So when you see Wilson and President Wilson and Bryan acting in Federal Reserve narratives, they're almost always acting in directions in alignment with Owen's goals. Now, why is it these figures and not Owen? When you read Owen for a bit, you start to realize that maybe he doesn't have the best bedside manner. He's not necessarily the most charming, suave. He's a Lynchburg elite native, and even though he lives in Muskogee, he still writes with a very high air of "I'm very bright and everyone else needs to catch up."
Okay. So why do we think that Owen is the real math architect of the Federal Reserve and not Carter Glass?
So for us, there's a couple of things. One is that Owen is brilliant in his economic writing. That's not to say he's always accurate, but it is to say that Owen has an extremely well detailed grasp of economics. Owen, in line or parallel to Irving Fisher's arguments, conceives of gold not as giving currency its value, but acting as security for its value. So one of the features of the Federal Reserve System is the Federal Reserve, despite kind of pretenses otherwise, it's not really a gold-backed dollar. The reserves are 40% reserves. So for all the money that's outstanding in the U.S. economy, the U.S. bank is to have 40% of gold in the Federal Reserve System. That's nothing to Owen. Owen's just like, this is just security. The currency is supposed to expand with the needs of business. Um, the currency functionally is pretty much a fiat currency. And that's one thing, is that Owen gets that the Federal Reserve is a fiat currency where a lot of his competitors and rivals do not, and that it operates as such. The other things are very subtle. In structure and organization of the Federal Reserve Bank, there's the creation of a public board to oversee it with ex officio members. And those ex officio members come from the Treasury, they come from the comptroller. Um, and then the president has power to appoint members to the board. These were insistent goals of Owen. When Owen read Glass's original draft, his original adaptation of the Federal Reserve Plan,
The Aldrich
um,
plan.
Glass's adaptation of the Aldrich Plan, this barely different, just modest tweaks. Owen's first criticism is that this is banker controlled, that this gives way too much money, way too much control of the money supply to private bankers. And private bankers' interests are private commerce. And so Owen insists that this needs to be a publicly controlled, publicly regulated system
Why?
because ultimately, coming back to those country banks, Owen is trying to irrigate credit deserts. He's trying to make funding and cash available to the West and Southwest and to country banks, and he's trying to make abundant cash available to those banks in moments of crisis. So Owen believes there should never be a crisis. He's particularly influenced by the German Reichsbank on this, that he's like, there's powers to prevent a crisis from ever occurring, and it's to flush banks with cash, even if they seem risky, even if they seem like they may go under, because that cash will stabilize them. And so Owen views this public control as necessary because if you leave bankers to run it, the conservative answer in a fire is to stay out of the fire. But Owen believes the central bank, as a lender of last resort, has to run into the fire.
Right.
And only the public interest will force bankers to run into the fire.
Right. And only the public interest that is accountable to voters
Exactly.
and not just bankers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by a fiat currency and an asset-based currency?
Absolutely. So really there's kind of three discussions of currencies going on. You have a classic metallic standard, or sometimes called commodity dollars. Um, these are dollars that their value is derived and connected to an actual physical material item with an external value. So in the case of gold, right? Dollars represent gold. And that in theory, it's the exchangeability of the paper money for gold that gives it value. The problem with that is there's only so much gold in the economy. So you have to figure out how to meet all the demands. And this is one of the struggles that the US had been trying to manage since the Civil War, and it had never gotten a good answer on. And so with finite amount of gold for stability, they turn around and try to come up with, okay, you don't want just paper money because if you get too much paper money, if dollars are tied to gold, it loses its value because the paper money, it becomes unredeemable. People don't want it. So the solution to this is what if we had this kind of intermediary currency, what we call an asset-based currency, that is tied to a financial transaction or a real bill. And the idea of this is that most businesses make 30-day transactions, so you'll agree to buy something, payments due in 30 days. The bank or the person that makes this transaction can go to the bank, give them their 30-day note. The bank will give them cash at a discount. Basically, they buy that obligation, and then you can refinance this through the system. Um, that money self-liquidates because in theory, in 30 days, you get the payment back from the person that agreed to the transaction. And so that keeps this money out of the system from staying too long. So in theory, you don't get the inflation of too much paper money. Fiat currency is currency, paper money that is solely backed by government. Faith and confidence in the government, its value is derived from the fact that the government insures it and the government encourages its use and the government makes it legal tender. Asset-backed currency was this way of kind of trying to bridge the demands of a metallic standard with the need for an expansion of fiat currency.
Okay. And the argument is that that is the type of currency created by the Federal Reserve?
The Federal Reserve accepts a broad interpretation of an asset-backed currency. And in accepting an asset-backed currency, the role of gold becomes much less significant in Owen's mind. And for Owen, gold is simply to facilitate international exchange. But the real faith and confidence in the dollar comes from these transactions, and it comes from the strength of the US economy and the confidence of the United States government as a creditor.
Yeah.
However, the banker orthodoxy never really shakes from no, its value is its redeemability in gold.
Mhm. And one of the aspects of the Federal Reserve is that Owen wrote, or it was wrote in that um, the gold standard, you know, could be um, U.S.
Suspended.
Yeah, suspended, right,
Yeah,
at
you
any
can
time.
suspend the gold reserve ratio and expand currency as needed. And in the case of World War One, the US never had to because well, for a lot of reasons, we got more gold that we were always within line. But for the most part, this ability to suspend this was viewed as a mechanism, understanding that, yeah, the currency can fluctuate unattached from gold if needed. The only limit Owen imagined was that you would charge a higher than market interest rate to keep bankers from borrowing credit excessively and speculating on the credit loans.
Right,
So you would borrow at a loss, but by borrowing at a loss, you would be able to get your credit on hand and meet needs.
right. You'd be able to meet the temporary crisis.
Exactly.
Okay. So mm, during the First World War, as you mentioned, there's not really any major currency crunches. Well, there's a brief one in 1914, but we don't need to go into that. Um, it resolves itself fairly quickly. Um, so the Federal Reserve is not really tested until 1920.
Great.
Okay, so what happens in 1920?
So, just a brief overview from 1914 to 1920, during the First World War, the US basically becomes the economic engine of the Allies. It exports a ton of goods to France, to the United Kingdom, and under the rules of trade, the US attracts a lot of gold in exchange for all this. They then also make a ton of loans to the Allied governments. And so the US at the end of World War One is in this position where it has an abundant amount of gold. It has exported a lot and incurred a lot of debts from Europe. And moreover, the Wilson administration geared the entire economy towards waging the war and pushed towards gearing the entire economy towards waging the war. And one of the big ways in which they did this was they encouraged farmers to grow as much as possible to replace the loss of output in the Allies. Whether it's in food, whether it's in cotton for uniforms, cotton was also big for ammunition. So this is like you have huge demands for these agricultural crops. And so the government again and again throughout World War One increasingly says farm, 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 grow, expand, farm. Well, with this in mind, with this inflow of gold, credit expands dramatically because farmers are borrowing more and more under this idea of real bills, right? You're making all these transactions with the government for export, you're making all these transactions with shippers, and so you're rediscounting in credit. And this creates some what are viewed as bubbles in the economy. Land gets more expensive as farms get more expensive. Prices for all goods are going up as government demand and wartime demand adds to this. And you have a lot of distortions in the economy. So we get to 1920. Inflation is extremely high. I wanna say that the price level is 180% over what it was in 1914.
Something.
Uh, yeah, it's like 180% of the prices 6 years ago. Um, and there are questions and debates over how to handle this. The US government is trying to issue a last round of debt and sell a last round of debt. If the Fed keeps interest rates low, it's really easy for the US government to sell debt and it's cheaper on the US debt burden. But you have inflation kind of pushing against this debt issuance. The Fed delays in order to market treasury notes. And then after that last round of treasury notes goes, the Federal Reserve decides that the reason prices are so high is speculation. So coming back to this idea of real bills and a gold backed dollar, the people that run the Federal Reserve largely believe that inflation is caused by the faith and confidence in the ability of currency to be redeemed for gold going down, that's depreciated. And so the only way you can get this under control is you have to start liquidating real bills. That is, you have to get people to quit making loans, you have to get people to quit making transactions, and that because bankers are to be disciplined, sound lenders, bankers are going to discipline their credit, look at their borrowers, and concentrate on lending only to their most reliable. And in this contraction, will bring down inflation. How does that go?
Well, if you're a farmer and you've taken out a lot of debt during the war to respond to what the government asked of you, and then all of a sudden the Fed decides to liquidate the economy, you are left in foreclosure, bankruptcy, and you lose your farm. And banks, and particularly small banks, collapse because they can't get the cash that they need to meet the demands of their depositors.
Adding insult to injury in all of this is the Federal Reserve also adopts the view that because ag prices rose higher than other prices, agriculture was increasingly speculative and that agriculture was largely to blame for its own problems. And so, as this liquidationist crash goes on, the Federal Reserve increasingly fires and attacks farmers as being the root cause of their own concerns.
Okay, so what are some of the things that the Fed does to liquidate the economy?
So there's several tactics available that the Federal Reserve uses. One of them is they raise the discount rate. That is the ability for you to take these asset-backed notes. When you take it to the Federal Reserve to discount, or when you give it to a bank and the bank takes it to the Federal Reserve to discount, you're basically selling these obligations at a discount. When the Federal Reserve raises the discount rate, they're basically saying they're charging you more money to buy that obligation from you. And so you're getting less cash back. That's step one. Step two, and perhaps most importantly, is the Federal Reserve begins actively campaigning and pressuring banks throughout their districts. The board issues several memos saying that we have to have liquidation, that we have too much speculation, that these are particularly local concerns that are the issue with this, and that we have to be more judicious in our lending. This includes not renewing notes. So one of the things that mattered for agriculture, and one of the things they secured in the agreement, in the creation of the Federal Reserve, is that agricultural notes could be discounted up to 90 days. So whereas a normal real bill would run 30 days and self-liquidate, that is, it would finish, cancel, and be removed from the economy and money supply, farmers had 90 days for their first transaction. But the problem with this is that the season could be 180 to 270 days. And so farmers had to renew their bills repeatedly, and their banks had to renew their bills repeatedly. And the Federal Reserve times their discount announcement to right after the planting season when farmers have taken out the first of these notes. And then the Federal Reserve begins saying, don't keep extending notes, don't keep extending credit, be judicious here. And the pressure this puts on banks, even though the Federal Reserve will come back later and be like, no, no, like, lend as much as you need to. It's a very kind of like half-hearted. Banks get confused. They don't know what to do. They don't know if they're supposed to be getting rid of their loans. They don't know if they're not supposed to be making extensions. And furthermore, this pressure crunch creates a decline in agricultural prices.
Why?
And so with the liquidation of credit, with the liquidation of these transactions, paired with the fact that Europe is going through its own monetary struggles, there's a significant drop in the demand for American agricultural exports. Um, from later reports, we see there's not that significant a supply difference in anything that farmers grew. So it's not like there was some vast overproduction and over amount of crops. Um,
Yeah, I think there's this notion that the 1921 cotton crop or the 1920 cotton crop was a massive bumper crop, but it wasn't.
Right, like, the typical narrative and the narrative the Federal Reserve kind of enforces is that there's this linear growth in cotton crops from
Right.
1914 to 1920, and by 1920, it's so big it's crashed. It's very uneven throughout the entire six-year period. Um, and so paired with the other aspect of this, sorry, slight international note, the Federal Reserve also quits lending money to Europe. So part of the Federal Reserve gets afraid about gold. And the Federal Reserve decides we're defending gold no matter what, despite the fact that Owen has built in a mechanism to drop that gold reserve requirement if needed. Another thing to add to this, the US is the only country in the world on the gold standard. So the US refuses to lend gold to Europe in 1920. This crashes European demand. Then the Fed decides to defend gold within the United States. This creates a crash and credit crunch and drop in demand for goods domestically as well. And so these two things drop farm prices. And then finally, these local banks, remember, these people don't have, like, the vast majority of borrowers are not the people also providing capital to the banks. There's only a handful of creditors, usually in small towns, that are capable of providing credit to create a bank. Those depositors start pulling out their cash to pay their debts as well. If you're a small town, if you're a large planter in a small country town, you're the depositor in the bank, but your income is still tied to prices. And if your crop prices go down, you have to pay your bills as well. And the final thing added to this is that the Federal Reserve takes out measures that specifically threaten to punish banks if they're overextended on credit above their own assets. So instead of the Federal Reserve acting as a irrigation system for providing credit to deserts, the Federal Reserve basically says you're only getting as much water as you put into the system. And so abruptly credit contracts in several of the places where credit's most strained.
Right. And so this is something that the Federal Reserve lobbies for through Congress. It's something called the Felon Amendment, named after a California senator who, um, and the bill allows Federal Reserve districts to decide that they can charge higher interest rates to banks that are, or higher discount rates, sorry, to banks that are over leveraged in their estimation, leading to, there's one example of a bank in Alabama that was paying something like 85% on its an 85% discount rate.
Yes. And to be clear, the Fed will come back later, and the Fed's defense in all of this, and this defense is taken at face value by most scholars, is the Fed goes, well, we didn't collect those interest rates. We canceled those interest rates. We didn't collect those charges. So look, the Felon Amendment actually didn't collect that much revenue, so it didn't have a distortion effect. The other thing they'll say is they'll be like, the Federal Reserve did increase its lending to agricultural districts. So we don't know why you think we didn't do our jobs or like why you're critical. But what this overlooks, and one of the things Rob and I uncovered through archival work, is this dramatically misses the psychological impact of the Felon Amendment. Because when the Felon Amendment was introduced, it was agrarian districts that implemented it. Dallas, Kansas City, St. Louis, they implemented the Felon Amendment. And part of them implementing the Felon Amendment is that for bankers in those districts, you don't know 2 years from now the Fed is not going to collect those interest rates. And so feds within, or banks within that district, start demanding payment on call, start demanding or their creditors start paying, cut off credit lines, and this forces a further liquidation of crops that drives prices down even further. And even though the Fed comes back and goes like, well, we didn't collect any money, so we don't know what the issue is. The issue is that it sparked a massive contraction of credit in those regions as banks desperately tried to crawl back capital to avoid getting hit with that punitive interest.
Right. It's, imagine that you've got a, I don't know, a hospital bill or something like that, that's several $1,000s, and the hospital, like, and you get upset about it, and the hospital bill says, "What's the problem? We forgave that debt 2 years later." It's like, "Yeah, but I didn't know you were gonna do that, so I had to cut out X amount of money in my budget every month to pay this bill until you forgave it."
Yeah,
Right?
yeah. And the other thing to add here is that this is actually where the limitation of Glass's Federal Reserve design came into play. Because the Federal Reserve is not one bank in 1920. The Federal Reserve is 12 regional banks. And while they think they've made themselves equal, the power is still concentrated in New York's hands, and non agricultural districts get deeply resentful of lending to the agricultural districts.
Mhm.
There's a particularly terse exchange between Cleveland's governors and Atlanta's governors, where Cleveland basically is just like, why are we subsidizing the over speculation of the Atlanta district? To which the Atlanta district's governor responded something to the effect of Cleveland is taking a parochial view of the situation. That the 12 banks are not
Right.
acting in coordination. There's deviation. New York raises their discount rates before others. The decentralized problems come to the fore. So not only is New York's financial power not removed, we also now have coordination issues within the 12 banks themselves.
So why Owen sets up this Federal Reserve in order to never have this problem?
Mhm.
Why does it happen if Owen designed it?
So this is where the issue of a bill's intent and an act's intent and legislative intent gets curtailed by the orthodoxies of people that are hired. So Owen's response to this crisis is, why are you concerned about gold? Gold is just insurance. It's just like going to a pawn store and offering collateral. You don't have to have exactly this amount of gold. You can just suspend the gold reserves. No one else is on the gold standard. You can suspend the reserve ratio and you can flood the cash to prop up these credit deserts, keep them afloat, let things stabilize. What Owen is further infuriated by, though, is that the banking orthodoxy at the time, the view of the board is that the inflation is driven by this speculation. And they believe that because there's inflation, that means there's speculation. And because there's speculation, that means there's credit scarcity. And so the logic and line of thinking of the Federal Reserve's leadership is that, oh no, we're out of credit and we're strained on credit because gold's about to be threatened. The US is at like a 43% gold reserve ratio in 1920. Prices are high. And so we have to defend gold. There must be a credit, there must be a credit scarcity, gold strained, so defend gold. And so what they interpret as a credit scarcity, Owen interprets as the Federal Reserve self-creating credit scarcity. And so for Owen, the Federal Reserve is a fundamental betrayal of everything the Reserve Board is set up to not be.
Right. Right. How do farmers respond to the Federal Reserve in the 1920s?
So it's a fascinating mixture because something remarkable to us is that farmers at first love the Federal Reserve System. Throughout World War I, they loved the Federal Reserve System. It's easy for them to get credit. It's easy for their bankers to get credit. They view the system as largely working. But after 1920, a couple of things bust up this image of the Federal Reserve System in their eyes. Well, a lot of bankers still appreciate the system, and their sense of confidence in it is fundamentally betrayed, even small country bankers, for a lot of different reasons. Um, but more important for farmers, they view the Fed as insufficient to meet their needs, that it can't provide them the intermediate credit, that is credit that loans that can go 2 years to 3 years. The Federal Reserve is incapable of doing that. They also view the Federal Reserve now as an untrustworthy body, as a banker-controlled body, not their reserve system that Owen and their advocates had told them it was.
Right.
And that's something to know is that Southern Democrats, Southwestern Democrats, agrarian Democrats really believe they create a system that will fix farmers' problems. Um, at this point, they start going to the state and expanding the state to circumvent the Federal Reserve. So in 1923, I believe we get the Agricultural Credits Act. That creates an addition to the federal land bank system. And these are basically publicly controlled cooperatives that loan credit on mortgages and then loan credit at intermediate rates to farmers.
Right.
And when that fails to solve farmers' problems, because this goes on throughout the entire 1920s, with the onset of the Great Depression, we see farmers embrace entirely a new state apparatus approach to credit and to money
That's outside of the Federal Reserve.
that's outside the Federal Reserve. I think the line we have is that rather than reform the Federal Reserve, they decide to neuter its ability to influence them and affect them. They basically go, if this is a banker institution, fine, let it be a banker institution, but don't let it affect me. And so they create credit streams for themselves through government subsidized credit, like the credit um,
Commodity Credit Corporation.
Commodity Credit Corporation. They force through the revaluation of the dollar. They concentrate the US's gold reserves in the hands of the Treasury, not the Federal Reserve. The New Deal represents a multi-pronged assault on the private banking system, and with not insubstantial, if not definitive support from agrarian agricultural interests.
Hmm. Hmm. All right. Well, Nathaniel, that was a great discussion. I think we're at an hour and 5 minutes. I think we've probably imposed ourselves on our listeners enough already. If you're interested in reading the article, we only really touched the surface of it. I think it's a meaty article. So I will post the article in the show notes, and I encourage everybody to read it. Nathaniel, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.